Okay,
Okay.
we are so glad you're here. I'm Sarah Brumfield. I'm here today with Ben, my partner, and we're going to talk about 10 ways AI will change archives. Our agenda, we're going to cover a bunch of different things: improving accessibility, extracting entities, matching entities, describing items, improving discovery, interacting with archival material, creating text from handwritten material, enhancing dirty text. Dirty means machine generated, not very good, transcribing audiovisual material, and how all of this is going to change archival workflows. We are recording, and we will send out a recording of this in the next couple of days. So you'll have a copy of it.
All right.
So I know you've been reading and hearing a lot about AI, and it seems kind of perhaps overblown, maybe kind of scary, but it's a big deal. Bill Gates, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for as a thinker on technology, and he's been around for a long time and seen many kind of big shifts in technology, thinks that AI is as fundamental as the creation of the personal computer or the internet, the mobile phone. And so what I like to think about when I start thinking about AI and my professional world is whether there's a scenario in the future that doesn't involve AI. I don't think there is. And so I think we all have a responsibility to learn and to think about how it works, what it means, how to use it for good. All of those things are part of our responsibility. And so what we're trying to do with all these webinars and the many other webinars we do is get you that information and help you start thinking about that. So let's talk about how it's going to change archives.
Okay, so Sarah and I focus on the technical applicant. Can you man the waiting room while I do this? We still have people trickling out. So we focus on, like, we're not AI researchers. We are researching AI applications. How can this actually be used in archives? So we're going to talk about some very concrete use cases that we think we see in archival work. A lot of this is the result of experiments that we've performed ourselves, or that some of our friends and colleagues and other institutions have performed. So the first thing we think AI can do is improve accessibility. So next slide, please. So this is a letter that's hosted on the Folger Shakespeare Library's MO platform, Early Modern Manuscripts Online. It's been transcribed diplomatically, so the original spellings, punctuation, abbreviations, all of those things have been retained. But knowing that that is not very accessible to a modern reader, the staff at the Folger also have created a regularized version. You can see the tabs up at the top gives the user the option of which version they want to see. That expands all the abbreviations. It brings the spelling up to the modern standard. It's really useful for the visually impaired, anyone using a screen reader, because screen readers really struggle with abbreviations and with non-standard punctuation. And it's also useful for anyone who's performing a full text search. So large language models like ChatGPT are very good at paraphrasing text. So we conducted a few experiments to see whether they could regularize the diplomatic transcription. So here's a comparison. All right, we fed the text to ChatGPT, and we compared its regularization to the one performed by the staff at the Folger. So the Folger version is on the left, the ChatGPT output is on the right. And I've got to say, the results are really good. So if you look at the third to the bottom line, it even got the abbreviation for your lordships correct. Go here, let me go back one screen. Yeah, if you see the third line here, that's YORLPS. I wouldn't have gotten that, right? That's really good. So the Folger Shakespeare Library version is a little bit closer to the original wording and punctuation. So ChatGPT did more normalization. But based on my experience using screen readers, I actually think the ChatGPT version would be more accessible for someone who's using a screen reader. So this is pretty exciting because the process of regularizing these transcripts is really pretty tedious. Our friends at the Folger have already been trying to automate this, and so this is pretty exciting. This is a nice little labor saver.
So our second idea is using large language models to extract entities. So we did some experiments where we asked Chat, can you go to the next slide, please? Where we asked ChatGPT to identify people named in a historical diary entry. This is from a project that we run on From the Page. It's a Virginia tobacco farm diary. It did a really good job identifying all the people mentioned in the entry. It even gave us context, who these people were, what they were doing. This isn't exactly what we asked for. So I asked it to go back and simplify it to just the names of the people. If you go to the next slide, you can actually do this with places as well. I don't know how useful it is because the places that are referenced in this particular entry are things like the schoolhouse or the mill, but it found them. We think this has a lot of potential for things like finding aids.
So that's great if you're working with a text that you know nothing about, and you're just trying to pull out some entities. But what about connecting the entities in a text to an authority file, like a list of people in a finding aid? So we ran an experiment with the same farm diary. Fortunately for us, volunteers had already tagged all the entities in it. So you can see all the kind of red text links. Those are entities that have been tagged by volunteers, which means we could use their work to see how an AI would do this. And we could compare the AI results with the human indexing. So the first thing we did was extracted the manually created entity names from the diary. And so the ChatGPT has this thing called a context window, which I tend to think of as how much stuff it can hold in its little bitty head, right?
That's
At
exactly
one time,
right, yes.
right? So I was only able to pull out the 100 most commonly mentioned entities in the diary to match against. But I also thought it would be interesting to pull out a little bit more context about the entities to feed to the AI. So I added a categorization of whether these were enslaved people or free people or places or businesses. And so then I fed it to ChatGPT with this prompt. After the word entities, I'll provide a list of entities in the category each entity belongs in. After the word text, I'll provide the text of a page from a 19th century diary. Identify the entities mentioned in the text using values from the list. So how did it do? Pretty well, actually. It extracted these people. It was able to match almost all of the entities in the page of text correctly. I was actually particularly impressed with the fuzzy matching that it did. You can see in number 6, number 8, 11, 13. Those are places where the AI is suggesting possible matches in the case of ambiguity. Number 13 is especially interesting because it realizes that Straightstone is a place. It connects it potentially to Straightstone, Virginia, but there's a space in it. That's the kind of thing I don't think you'd be able to use with rule-based approaches in OpenRefine or spreadsheets or something like that. The only thing that it got really wrong was Yates Mill. So the original text is awkwardly worded. The diary writes about people going to the mill, Yates Mill, right? And that confused it. It assumed that this was a person named Mill Yates, which is not actually correct. Our friend Christopher Poland at the University of Graz did something even more interesting. He used the Bing search plugin to ChatGPT to ask ChatGPT to not only identify entities within a text and tag them, but also to look up the entities in Wikidata, right? So this is asking the AI to do something that seems a little bit like a research task that a human would do. Interacting with the web, interacting with authorities. And you can imagine something like, oh, look this up in Library of Congress subject headings once these things get a little bit better. So how did that do? Well, this is the result. You look at any of these place names, the place name tags in TEI, the reference attribute has Wikidata URLs. These are accurate Wikidata URLs. If you go to them, you will actually see entities. This is pretty cool. The problem is you still need to check this. Look at this first URL. It identifies the place name of Graz, which is the city that Christopher lives in, as Q1741. If you actually look at Wikidata and look at that URL, Q1741 is not Graz. It's a different city. It's Vienna. So as with all of these, you have to have a human reviewing them. And let me just pitch, if any of you speak German, Christopher's series of webinars on ChatGPT and AI are spectacular. They're really good.
So it's also, there's a lot of potential for describing items. So you go to the next slide. Matt Miller at the Library of Congress did a series of experiments with the Susan B. Anthony collection. So this is a already transcribed collection from the Library of Congress. And one of the things he asked the GPT APIs to do is summarize each letter in the collection. So that's what you see on screen here. And you have, a short one-sentence summary of what's going on in the letter. But he did a couple of variations. That was a one-sentence summary, but this screenshot shows a 4-sentence summary, and the slider on the right lets you change how many sentences are in the summary, which is pretty cool. We're doing some experiments right now where we're working on creating really dense summaries from material, because I find that one of the things that the GPT models are not very good at is conciseness and getting, packing as many of the important bits into a short summary. So actually there's a newsletter that we're sending out tomorrow that kind of talks about an approach that people have been using to do that. I think the other thing that's interesting here is that the line between some of the accessible versions of the text that Ben talked about earlier with the Folger, especially if you start imagining accessible versions that are, say, appropriate for an 8th grader, and these summaries, it starts getting blurry, doesn't it? So that's kind of interesting. When does a simplified variant become a summary?
So another thing that we are exploring is improving archival discovery. So from the page, we host archival projects from a lot of different institutions, but there's currently no really easy way for a volunteer who's been transcribing material for the Maryland State Archives to discover material from the University of Maryland, even though that might interest them. So we're working on trying to come up with a way of tagging projects so that people can go from one thing they're interested in to another. So we have a series of tags that were created by an archivist and applied to some of our collections. So we have a way of comparing her work to the AI's work. So this is the prompt that we used. Pick 3 tags from the following list. And as you can see, ChatGPT tends to invent things. Pick tags only from the list. Do not give me anything that isn't in the list, right? And then we passed in the titles and descriptions of the collections that we host that have been entered by archivists at many, many different institutions. So how did it do? Let's compare what the AI produced with the archivist. So this is a project that the Indianapolis Public Library hosts of the photographic collections from the Indy Parks and Rec Department. And ChatGPT identified this as parks, which is correct, photographs and images, which is also correct. Both of those match what the professional archivist put on, but it also added 19th century. These photographs are all from the 20th century. It spotted the word, the 1895 in the description, and I think it just latched onto that.
It tends to overcorrect for dates. What we actually ended up doing for this kind of strategy is separating out tags that were dates and tags that weren't, because we really want them to be separate processes, because at this point on the concepts, it doesn't do so well on the dates.
Yes. And it loves to tag things with dates, even if they're wrong. So here's another example, also a photographic collection. These from China. So ChatGPT tagged this with China, 20th century, photographs and images. All those are correct. These might actually be a little bit better than the tags that the archivist used, right? University is kind of broad. Education is kind of broad. I think that someone looking for China is going to find this project and probably be a little more successful with it.
One of the interesting things is because the GPT models, all the large language models, are kind of statistical words and what words tend to be most predictable. that actually means that you get things like categories that are kind of the most obvious, which I actually think is what you want if you're trying to connect the public with collections.
Right. There's an essayist who I follow who talks about the problems with AI being that they are aggressively conventional. They're not going to produce anything surprising, which I think is absolutely correct. So they're not great at helping you write interesting things. But for tagging projects, you kind of want something that's aggressively conventional and thinks like everyone else does.
So another kind of approach is for improving discovery is being able to search similar text. So this is back to the Susan B. Anthony Papers project that Miller did. And in that interface, you can actually highlight a term, and you can't quite see it in my screenshot, but here it's Political Equality Club. And then you can right click and say search similar text. And go ahead, next slide. This kind of seems like old hat, like normal search results, which we've been doing for decades now, right? What's returned is 3 letters where she also mentions the Political Equality Club. But that's not exactly what's going on here. Next slide. This is actually a conceptual similarity search for things that are close to each other in this great big matrix of the large language model. So I think it's easier to understand in this example. I selected Catholic, and what's returned are letters that have concepts that are close to Catholic. So if we look on the left side here, the first entry mentions things like Sister Mary. It's actually how Anthony refers to one of her comrades as a sister. And it mentioned, but it's not, a Catholic sister. It talks about church and it has words like Orthodox and, sermons and things like that. So conceptually, you can kind of see why the model was like, no, this feels like it's close to Catholic. And if you look, it's not until we get to the 4th entry here where we have terms that, we would think of as actual Catholic terms. So the phrase Roman Catholic shows up by the 4th one. And that is actually the only thing that's mentioned there that makes it match. But the 5th one, you start getting Catholic schools and Father Kiernan and St. Mary's. And, I think a human would kind of lean into those, but it's interesting how much of the things above it were conceptually matched to it. So sometimes this works really well, and sometimes it doesn't. It kind of gets off in the weeds if you have really unique words or uses of words. Go ahead to the next one. You can also, in Matt Miller's interface, view similar text to an entire entry or letter. So in the red box on the left here, it says view similar text. And that's the same as if you had selected the entire entry and asked it to match on that text, to find things that were similar to that in the same kind of conceptual way. And next slide. Here's the results from that. This was an entry about the Political Equality Club, some birthdays, and just some details of kind of ordinary everyday life. And I did not find the results to be compelling or useful at all. So, I think there's potential here, but it's maybe when you have a lot of material that's similar, this doesn't help a whole lot. If you have a lot of kind of hodgepodge of uniqueness, then maybe you would be, pleased with the type of results you had looking for documents that were similar to each other.
So another interesting thing we might be able to do is locate particular documents or particular passages of documents by classifying them based on contents. If we go back to the farm diary, we want to know about pages that mention people who are enslaved. That's one of the things we're researching. So asking ChatGPT the question about whether enslaved people are mentioned in these entries actually works pretty well. Now, if you think about a lot of the state archives that we work with, a lot of university collections, a lot of them are working really hard to try to serve descendant communities of formerly marginalized groups. And a lot of those names, a lot of those people show up in legal documents, right? You have wills, you have inventories, you have court cases. But it's kind of like finding a needle in the haystack, right? There's all this boilerplate, there's all this legalese that's really hard for humans to go through and transcribe or index or research. So the idea of being able to identify just the pages that mention enslaved people, just the documents that are worth someone spending their time to do research on. I think that's pretty exciting. I think there's a lot of potential there.
So one of the other things we've been experimenting is interacting with archives, kind of archival collections. And so the question is, what if you could interact with them in a conversational way? You go to the next slide. You ask a question, and the bot, in this case, returns the relevant bits of the collection and answers in plain language with attribution and references back to the collection material. So this is an experiment we did. There's a lot of these starting to show up around podcast transcripts or newsletter collections. So what we did is we took, again, this same farm diary, and we took each entry from that diary, and it uses the same sort of similarity that the Susan B. Anthony project used when we were matching whole entries to other whole entries. It takes the question and it says, which of these entries seems like it's the closest? And then it takes that entry, and go to the next slide, please, and packages up the entry and the question and this kind of prompt that we worked pretty hard at developing in order to return in plain language an answer to the question. So it says, you're a historian analyzing transcription of primary source documents, kind of gives it the context around the collection. You'll be provided with a page of text from the diary under the text section, the question under the question section. Answer the question based on the page and what can be inferred from the page. Like, don't go off script. That's kind of the thing we're saying there. Please answer pleasantly and accurately. The question cannot be determined or inferred from the page text. Please respond, I'm sorry, I don't know. So, this was just an experiment we did. There's a lot of refining we'd love to do where, instead of just a single entry, maybe you pull the top 5 that match the question and you feed all 5 in along with the question to get kind of a more nuanced answer. We also think this sort of interface can point people back to the primary source documents and the particular pages or entries of the primary source documents. So it's an interesting way to give people kind of access and research access to those documents, but then still be able to send them back to the pages to read for themselves and cite. There is a problem with this approach because it's really hard to ask questions of a collection if you don't really know anything about the collection, right? It's a bootstrapping problem. So I think there's a lot of interface questions and kind of how do we help people develop those questions without having, what comes first, right? Maybe you need to provide a whole lot of introduction to the collection in order to let them start seeing what the questions might be.
So another thing that we see AI doing is creating text from handwriting. So, libraries and archives have been scanning documents for 4 or 5 decades now, I believe. And the challenge that we all face is that those documents are often handwritten, and fundamentally what we're ending up with is pixels, right? So you can't hit Control F in this document and find the word Newcastle, for example. So we work with the State Library of Queensland on their colonial secretary correspondence, and they provided us with the output of a HTR process, and HTR is short for handwritten text recognition. Think of it as like OCR for handwriting, even though the principles are pretty different. And so what do we get out of an HTR process? Well, what we get out is text that is not great. Instead of I have the honor to inform your excellencies, we have LMEs. There are a lot of issues with this document. My arrival in the Tnappen instead of snapper, which is the correct word. It does okay on a lot of words, but a lot of cases, they're not the important words. The arrival, that's great, but I don't think anyone's going to be searching for arrival in the archives.
But they might search for snapper, right?
They might search for snapper, or they might search for Newcastle. So let's compare the outputs of the HTR versus the output of a human transcription. So they have humans who are correcting this and transcribing it. What I've done here is I have italicized all the important words that are different. And, it's it is, again, kind of unfortunate that it's good at the most common words, at and that and along and the, but really the important ones are missing.
It's a challenge. Like, I don't think I would want to show a researcher this type of HTR text. We might show someone on a crowdsourcing platform like From the Page HTR as an assist, and we're actually doing some work in that direction now, because it gives humans a lot of trouble. You know, certain words give humans a lot of troubles that the machines get, and then the machines have a lot of trouble with words that the humans might get.
So the next question is, if you have this raw, dirty HTR text, can you use a tool like ChatGPT to enhance it? So here's the prompt that I used. I said, you're a historian reading 19th century correspondence to the British colonial secretary. And all this context is actually really important, right? About the exploration and settlement of Australia. The correspondence has been converted to text using handwritten text recognition. It's got a lot of errors. Using your expertise, you can correct these errors to produce a better version of the text. So let's see how it did. And let me point out that we gave it a bailout clause. If words are too hard to guess, replace them with question marks. Okay, so let's look at the HTR and ChatGPT. It did an okay job of correcting excellencies both times. It actually did correct Newcastle correctly. The things that are kind of worrisome are that it corrected Snappin, which as we know is the name of the ship Snapper, to Harappan. Well, that might actually be the name of a ship, except it's not. It's not the right ship. You can see this even more prominently with the last word, the direction, North Sud. It corrected that to northeast. And right, we know the real word is northward. Northeast is wrong, but it looks plausible. This is the peril of using these AIs, is that they're very good at being plausible without any regard to whether or not they are correct. So I really worry about these kinds of use cases because, I think that this is even more misleading than the raw HTR would be.
But, if we go back to these questions like, is an enslaved person mentioned on the page? This is probably good enough to answer that question and surface pages for humans to look at and work on. And that's really interesting, because even though it'll miss things and it'll get things wrong, if it can help you narrow your focus and find what you want to concentrate and work on, that's a win.
Right.
We run a crowdsourcing platform. We really believe in collaboration and in humans, especially passionate volunteers who have a drive to contribute to history. Many of them are genealogists who want to work to improve the data that genealogists use to do their research. So a lot of our thinking right now is, how do we use these strategies and these tools to help them? Or how can we use all those passionate volunteers to, check this, correct this? We don't know, but those are the questions that we're grappling with.
Right. Right. As you can see, we definitely do not want to replace humans with the result of HTR and AI, right? That's not going to be good.
So one of the other things we're super excited about is using AI for transcribing audio-visual material. We do a Mellon-funded project with Professor Tanya Clement at the University of Texas, Austin, and it's called AV Annotate. And through that, we've learned just how much AV material is locked away in archives. There's permissions issues with publishing it. There's preservation issues. A lot of it's on plastic and it's degrading. Anything that we can do that make AV material more useful kind of changes the equations on whether we preserve it, because people will, if we can get people to start using it more, then it makes more sense to put more money into preserving it. But we also want people to be able to find things. And when you have a 3-hour-long recording and you want to find the 15 minutes where they mention or interview a particular person, that's terribly time consuming and really hard to do. So we think this is going to be a really fascinating and game-changing approach. So the next couple of slides I borrowed from our friend Will Hicks at the University of North Texas. Will ran these experiments using Whisper AI, which is also by OpenAI, but it's available to download and use on your own computers. The computer power requirements actually pretty hefty. Will diverted some of their new large GPU gaming units to run these experiments. But his first experiment, I just pulled a couple of slides, but there's a whole webinar that we did about a month ago with Will where he dives into all of this if you want to go find that. So the first one was with a jazz musician, Louis Armstrong. He has this beautiful but very difficult to transcribe voice. And it took Will's student days to transcribe the recording, which is kind of what you see in blue at the top. And yet it still has errors. The middle is another automatic speech recognition program, kind of for comparison purposes. And at the bottom is Whisper's unedited output via a large language model. So the error rate for the human and Whisper was about equal. Whisper, however, finished the file in a couple of minutes rather than a couple of weeks. This is kind of another example of an experiment Will ran, and kind of he was looking here at the cost savings of using these tools, of using Whisper in particular. So this is a Spanish language interview, and they paid a vendor to transcribe it. The interview is 51 minutes long, and the transcription cost them $222. They had the file back after about 9 days. They couldn't justify translating it, which would have run between $500 and $1,200, depending on kind of accuracy and pricing tier. So let's compare that to Whisper. So it was done on the same day, and the transcription is very readable. And he ran a diff between the texts, and Whisper is like 90% the same as the human transcription, with some of the differences just being formatting of numbers, contractions, some lost punctuation, some spelling differences, and the like. From Will's perspective, this is substantially better than nothing, and it is substantially more cost-effective and faster than using a human to do this. So our kind of final wrap it all together change that we see coming is changing archival workflows. When we started from the page 18 years ago, we expected folks to have digitized material, probably in a DAMS, with at least some metadata, and to import that into from the page for crowdsourcing. What we found is that isn't actually true. Folks are digitizing material because they want the engagement that comes from crowdsourcing, and then they're ingesting it into their systems with this really rich metadata that's provided by crowdsourcing, by indexing, by transcribing. None of that has to do with AI. But if you think about all the ideas that we've presented today, you've got to start with digitization. Then we think that you'll transcribe either with humans or machines, or a combination of both humans and machines, so that you have inputs to these automated processes that will help you describe the documents. And only after you've generated all that data, and that's a lot of derivative data that our current systems are not good at managing, searching, displaying, will you ingest it into your downstream access and preservation systems. It's going to be a challenge, a pretty big challenge. And, we're going to have to rethink our systems, our processes. Search becomes a much bigger problem, but also a much bigger opportunity. So we're excited about it, and we're kind of hope you are too. Oh, that was my slide. Look at what I just said. So, we run from the page. We're a crowdsourcing, transcription, description, indexing, OCR correction platform. We're offering this new quick start call where if you bring around 200 pages, PDF or images, we will get a project. We'll work with you in a 30-minute call to get a project up and running. And then, we'll do our best to feature it to volunteer transcribers on our platform, but you can also then take it back to your community and encourage them to work on it as well. So this will be in the follow-up email that we sent out. Yeah. So questions? Let's stop sharing maybe.
Yeah. So, let's start with maybe questions if there are any in the chat. Sorry, I'm still admitting people in the waiting room. One thing that I thought was really interesting that Beth Arthur pointed out was that we let the bot say, "I don't know." This is really important, giving these AI tools a bailout clause. Otherwise, they will provide answers if they have to make them up. Right? It is so important to say that. Another question.
Yeah, the semantic search bot, was that done through the GPT, through ChatGPT or another platform? So that used the GPT APIs. So it was scripted, and we actually called programmatically the same underlying models that ChatGPT uses.
Tom asked if we could put up our get started slide
yeah,
again.
we're
Sure.
happy to give you the marketing slide. Yes.
we can share that, and then we'll go back and take more questions. There we go. Okay. So let me pull open the chat again. And we'll probably dismiss this after. Will the recording be made available? Love to share it with colleagues.
Yes, there'll be an email that goes out in the next couple of days with the recording.
Okay, you good, Tom?
Let's.
Okay. So does anybody else have questions? What was the name of the HTR that was used, or do we have recommended platforms? So that HTR was provided by an Australian archives vendor, technology vendor who works with archives. We don't know what tools that they used. What I can tell you is that we are currently working on integrating HTR functionality from the page itself, so that you can upload documents from the page. HTR will be run, and then you can correct that. The challenges that we run into is that we don't want to replace humans with the AI, as you can tell already, right? So we are doing a lot of work on making sure that human transcribers, whether they are volunteers or staff members, will be at the center of this HTR process. So we're trying to do things like draw people's attention to words that we think are the HTR got wrong, for example. We're trying to make it more of an assistant than a replacement.
Let's see. Did we try a lot of prompts for the HTR? Moving my chat. The HTR corrections. So giving a lot of specific instructions to the large language model is important to have good corrections, such as do not correct proper names. We probably didn't do enough.
Right. We'd like to do more. If anybody has recommendations for making this, but frankly, it would be a benefit just to have ChatGPT replace things that are wrong with question marks, so that your attention was called to the things that HTR process get wrong. We added that as a bailout clause in our prompt, and it didn't use it. So
sometimes it does. I think you get less, is what we've kind of found. But so we addressed ChatGPT with you in our prompts. Is that standard practice by coders? Yes. In fact, you'll notice almost all of our prompts, all of our good prompts, start with "you are a," and we put historian, archivist, metadata specialist, whatever we're using. And that is, to me, one of the power tools of prompt writing, is giving it a role to play, because it skews what it's going to answer in a direction that is closer to what that professional would answer. The other thing that we've kind of learned doing all of this, and our examples don't show as much of this as I would like, is more context is better. You give it more instructions on, like, here's how to think about this, here's an example, here's instructions that I've found on the web for how someone in my role or that role would do this. If you add a lot more of that, you get better results.
Okay.
How did you qualitatively assess the results with Susan B. Anthony, the 88, 80%? Did you check each result against certain criteria? I can't remember where the 88 and 80% came by. Those are not our experiments. Those are by Matt Miller. So we thought they were great because it kind of pulled all these ideas together into a really cool interface. But let me go find the link to his write-up about.
Yeah. And his write-up was really good. One of the things, he is very critical of AI tools, and one of the things that he points out that he found completely unacceptable was that when documents were blank and he asked ChatGPT to summarize them, it would just make something up. This is also something that Will Hicks discovered, that long passages of silence in the AV material that Whisper AI was transcribing. Again, ChatGPT would just, Whisper AI would just make up just some words, some filler. It is kind of distressing.
I'm going to pull Matt Miller's write up, and then it has links to his project in here.
In the chat.
And put it in the chat for y'all.
David asks, help create the best questions or the best prompts.
I'm going to go find our webinar on chat writing, on prompt writing, rather.
Yeah, so we did conduct a webinar on prompt engineering for libraries and archives.
Actually, I've got a whole playlist of kind of our AI stuff that I'm going to drop in. You know, I think the thing to realize is this stuff is new, changing fast, and we're getting smarter all the time. So I'm like, I don't really want to share that because we've gotten a lot better since then, but it's a good place to start.
So Marina says, did we have a chance to test the AI to transcribe text of audio that's not in English or a non-Latin alphabet? As Sarah mentioned, the presentation by Will Hicks that's in that YouTube playlist does talk a lot about languages, as you'd expect. Languages that have a lot of bilingual content online, that had a lot of training data for Whisper AI, were best. English is not actually the most accurate language. Spanish is better. But once you get down into more rarely spoken languages, languages that aren't as well digitized, languages that aren't from the developed world, there's a big problem. Yeah,
kind of like I saw talk on like Sami in Scandinavia, Norway.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's terrible at Sami.
Right. It's fine at Norwegian. It's terrible at Sami. Yeah.
So there's a question: with our expertise, what do you think will be done in the future with AI and metadata, in particular, descriptive types and controlled vocabulary with more modern, inclusive vocabulary? Ooh. So categorization is something that a large language model is good at. So we're doing more and more experiments in this area to kind of give, here's a text, here's a controlled vocabulary of subject headers, for instance. And for us, we're not pulling everything because we kind of want to limit what the model is looking at. We're not saying here's all of Library of Congress subject headings. Maybe we should, we don't really know. And then kind of our plan is to have humans review that. Because we still think you need humans to do the review. But I think creating metadata is the sort of thing that these models are very good at.
So there's a couple of questions that we actually missed. One question is, have we tried historical handwritten transcription with ChatGPT 4.0? So I have seen demos of people using the vision feature of GPT 4.0 to send images of handwritten text to ChatGPT and ask it to transcribe them. The results look fairly promising.
It's pretty good.
Except that it's really not good at marking the things it's unsure of. So I worry about reliability. But we have not done a real comparison of that versus, say, Transkribus or tools like that, or other more traditional HTR techniques. Tom Belton says that they're interested in place name entities and the possibility of AI automatically mapping them to, say, Google Earth. So that is very close to what Christopher Poland was doing in his example of, he was using ChatGPT's Bing integration and pointing it at Wikidata. But you can imagine pointing it at something like GeoNames or Google Earth, as you mentioned, to pull in place names into geocode material within text. It is, again, something that you absolutely have to have humans review once you're on the other side of things. So I think there's promise.
I mean, there's a lot of promise, but like historical geography is like where you're going to match to is not necessarily going to be in Google Earth, right? And that's where it gets kind of harder.
Yes. Jill says that she's really looking forward to using AI to improve search and handwritten documents. So are we, right? And even material that is handwritten and transcribed. You know, the example from the Folger, if you want to search for lordship, you know, that cleaned up version, that regularized version is going to be what people are searching against. And we're pretty keen on that.
I'm scrolling back to see if we missed anything. I think we got it all. Yeah. Okay, there's, feel free to ask more questions, but
yeah. And if anyone would like to unmute themselves, you can try doing that as well.
Some questions, yeah. Always nice when our federal supporters tell us we're doing a good job. Thank you, Kristen.
Do we want to mention when our next webinar is?
Do
we have it scheduled yet?
Oh, yeah. We've got our next one we have coming up, if you want to pull up the link, is using a piece of ChatGPT called the code interpreter, which is a terrible name for it, but it's we're going to pull data from Library of Virginia's Virginia Untold project that they publish on the Virginia Data Portal. Then we're going to analyze it using this AI-driven analysis tool. So I think it's going to be really interesting and fun. I haven't done a ton with that tool, so it's gonna we're looking forward to learning it ourselves. And then we've got a Your First Crowdsourcing Project webinar coming up if you're interested in crowdsourcing. And then the Wilford Woodruff Papers is a documentary edition project in Utah, and they are doing some really interesting things. They're doing kind of our standard, transcribe, annotate sort of things that documentary editions do. But then they also have some downstream uses of, they've got a Wilford Woodruff AI experience that they've built using transcriptions and some other tools and some of these AI tools. So I'm excited about that.
All right. Thank you all for coming.